Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. News of the decision by West Point to remove Confederate symbols from its campus reminded me of just how tightly intertwined Confederate military history is with America's story. The news turned my research mind right back to the 19th century and to a primary source, my go-to source for information about West Point graduates from that time period. The book, available in several volumes, you can easily find it online, is called The Biographical Register of the Officers and Graduates of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York. Those of you who look at primary sources from the 19th century or books in general from that period know those long headlines. This book has one too. The book nowadays is known by researchers like me as Cullum's Register for its author, George Washington Cullum. He was a brevet general. He was a studious man, and he was also best remembered for the yeoman's work he did to compile all the minutiae, the various facts connected with the West Point graduates when they were promoted, when they did their great deeds in battle, all of that information. He's written all of the biographies in a serial format, more or less bullet points with the facts of their military service. And so I went to that book because I was reminded of the Confederate, or I should say, the West Point graduates who resigned to become soldiers in the Confederate Army. And here's one of the pages, which I think is a great example of what or how Cullum treated those men who left the service to join the Confederate Army. Here's Robert E. Lee's page. And as you can see, Cullum has painstakingly laid out all of the details of Robert E. Lee's service until 1861. At the very bottom of this page, which is the end of Lee's entry, it simply says, joined in the rebellion of 1861-1866 against the United States. There it is. And so every soldier, every West Pointer who went on to military service in the Confederate States has that ending. And at that point, Cullum cuts the person off completely. There's no more follow-up. You have to remember, this particular volume, this is the 1868 volume. We're at a period in history where the war has recently ended. Feelings are still raw, emotions are running high, attitudes are still very tightly wound, and the softening that later occurs during Reconstruction, reunification, as that lost cause narrative really takes hold. We're before that period of time. So there's really some hard edges at this point. And West Point, of course, is no exception to that. West Point has had some bumps and bruises along the way. Roughly, I think 20% of its number went ahead and resigned, like Robert E. Lee, to join the Confederate Army. So what caught my attention as I was going through and taking a look, refreshing my mind on some of these entries, I went to the beginning of the book, and I don't usually go there. The part of the book that I went to was all of the officers who are basically complimenting Cullum on his work. The first person, the first officer who speaks in favor of Cullum's work is none other than Ulysses S. Grant. Now, those of you who know a little bit about Grant or know anything about him know that he's quiet. He's not the person who is a great public speaker. In person, he's quite a bit different, but when he's in public, not quite so much. when he does speak, it's generally short and to the point. And so such is the case here. He doesn't have a lot to say, but what he has to say, there's no mincing words on his comments. And so I'm going to read this to you. This is, again, General U.S. Grant speaking about Cullum's register. And he addresses his comments to Cullum. My dear General, I have received your biographical register of the officers and graduates of the United States Military Academy, which you have done me the honor to forward for my acceptance. The work ought to show to the enemies of the Military Academy that if they expect to harm the institution in the minds of the American people, they must keep from their view the services rendered to the country by its graduates. Your book will receive the favor of all graduates, except perhaps hereafter from those who see recorded against them, quote, joined in the rebellion of 1861 to 1866 against the United States, end quote. This ought to be odious. With great respect, your obedient servant, U.S. Grant, General. So there you have it. General Ulysses S. Grant writing his thoughts to fellow General George Washington Cullum on the Biographical Register of West Point graduates. Until we meet again, happy trails.